Buckskin Girl, Marcia Lenore King. In April 1981, three young men discovered something that would haunt Troy, Ohio for decades. A woman's body in a roadside ditch, wrapped in a distinctive buckskin poncho. For 37 years, she remained nameless, becoming known only as Buckskin Girl. But when technology finally caught up with tragedy, the answer was closer than anyone imagined. Marcia Lenore Sossaman King was born on June 9, 1959, in Arkansas, growing up in a blended family after her parents divorced. She had a brother Daniel King and half-brother Jonathan Sossaman, both of whom passed before her identification. Her stepmother Cindy later described her as very trusting, a trait that may have made her vulnerable on the road. In 1980, Marcia left home, possibly seeking independence, and her family hoped she would return. They never filed a missing persons report. What they didn't know was that Marcia had been traveling extensively. Forensic pollen and isotope analysis on her clothing would later reveal she spent time in Oklahoma, Texas, especially Fort Worth, Pittsburgh, and Louisville, Kentucky in the months before her passing. These scientific techniques analyze plant residue and chemical signatures to trace where someone has been, painting a picture of constant movement across the country. On April 24, 1981, her body was found along Greenlee Road in Troy, Ohio, lying in a fetal position in a ditch near Interstate 75. She was barefoot, but her feet were remarkably clean, suggesting she had been transported to the location after her passing. The buckskin poncho that covered her would become her identifier for nearly 4 decades. She had reddish-brown hair worn in pigtails and freckles. The autopsy revealed extensive blunt force trauma to her head and neck, followed by strangulation. Her liver was lacerated from the beating. Forensic examination showed no evidence of intimate assault. The good condition of her dental health and scars, indicating an active life, suggested someone who had been healthy and mobile. Investigators determined she had passed approximately 48 hours before discovery. The initial investigation generated over 200 leads, but none could identify her. Detectives explored connections to the unsolved Redhead murders, a series of cases involving women with reddish hair found along highways, but these links were disproven. The case languished for years. DNA profiling began in 2001, and her profile entered CODIS in 2009, yet no matches emerged. Everything changed in April 2018. The DNA Doe project, using genetic genealogy through GED matched Marcia's DNA to a first cousin. This represented one of the earliest successes of investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that would later identify the Golden State Killer. The breakthrough came from a preserved blood sample taken in 1981, carefully stored for decades. A genealogist working the case noted that her father's upload to GED match was like putting a note in a bottle to tell the world, "What happened to my daughter?" He had been searching, too. In July 2018, a memorial service was held at Riverside Cemetery in Troy, where locals who had tended her grave for 37 years finally learned her name. Cindy Sossaman told the gathering, "Words don't describe the feelings we have for all of you." Miami County Sheriff Dave Duchalk stated, "We always have hopes to bring justice for homicide victims and their families." But identifying Marcia didn't solve her case. Additional hair samples were submitted to CODIS in 2020, hoping for a match to a perpetrator, but none has been found. Theories range from a violent hitchhiking encounter to an abusive partner she may have traveled with, but without evidence, these remain speculation. The Miami County Sheriff's Office keeps the investigation open, waiting for that one crucial piece of information that might finally bring justice. While Marsha's story ended on a roadside, the next case began in a backyard on a summer day. Little Miss Nobody, Sharon Lee Gallegos. Sharon Lee Gallegos was born on September 6, 1955, in New Mexico, growing up in Alamogordo with her mother Guadalupe, who worked as a motel maid. The family lived modestly in a multi-generational household, with Sharon's siblings Ramona and John, her grandmother, and 6 other relatives. Family members described her as feisty and happy-go-lucky, a spirited personality that made what happened next even more heartbreaking. Her fair complexion earned her the family nickname La Güera. On July 21, 1960, Sharon was playing in her grandmother's backyard when she caught the attention of 2 people who had been watching the children. A couple in a dark green 1951 to 1952 Dodge or Plymouth sedan approached, with the woman offering Sharon candy and clothes. The woman was described as short and heavy-set, in her 30s, with dirty blonde hair and glasses. Her companion was thin and fair-skinned with sandy hair. When Sharon resisted their offers, they dragged her into their vehicle as her cousins watched helplessly. The stalking behavior suggested this wasn't random. They had targeted her specifically. 10 days later, on July 31, 1960, a devastating discovery was made over 500 miles away in Sandwash Creek Bed near Congress, Arizona. A young girl's body was found partially buried and charred. She wore a checkered blouse, white shorts, and cut-down adult sandals, shoes that had been modified to fit her smaller feet. Someone had painted her nails. The remote location required navigating rough terrain, suggesting the perpetrators either knew the area or deliberately sought isolation. The autopsy could not determine a specific cause due to the condition of the remains, but the manner was ruled homicide based on the suspicious circumstances. No trauma was visible beyond the burning. The community of Congress, moved by the tragedy, donated a cemetery plot. A headstone was placed reading, "Little Miss Nobody, blessed are the pure in heart, St. Matthew." For 62 years, that would be her only name. The FBI joined the investigation, analyzing a bloody knife and footprints discovered near the scene. Investigators pursued leads on transient families and set up roadblocks across the region, but the couple in the green sedan vanished. Leads on suspicious individuals were tracked down and cleared. The trail went cold. Sharon's family in New Mexico had no idea their feisty little girl had been found. They only knew she was gone. Decades passed. Then in 2018, authorities exhumed the body from that Congress cemetery plot to obtain DNA samples. The genetic material was sent to Othram, a forensic laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis. The lab worked to extract usable DNA from remains that had been buried for nearly 6 decades, then built a genetic family tree to find living relatives. In March 2022, the breakthrough arrived. DNA matching confirmed that Little Miss Nobody was Sharon Lee Gallegos. Othram's Kristen Middleman explained that their technology can assess identity without requiring the person to be in any database. They work outward from genetic markers to build family connections. Sharon's nephew, Ray Chavez, expressed the family's bittersweet relief. "Thank you for keeping my aunt safe and never forgetting her." In 2022, Sharon was exhumed once more, this time to be reburied alongside her mother in Tularosa, New Mexico. She had finally come home. The investigation remains active. Cousins who witnessed the abduction have provided additional details to investigators, and authorities continue seeking information about the couple in the green sedan. The description remains remarkably specific. Someone, somewhere, might remember them. But the motive remains a mystery. The family's poverty made ransom unlikely. What drove two people to stalk and take Sharon that summer day may never be understood, but at least she is no longer nobody. From a case that began with an abduction, we move to one that ended on Valentine's Day. Valentine Sally, Carolyn Celeste Eaton. Carolyn Celeste Eaton was born on October 1st, 1964, in Missouri, growing up in Bellefontaine neighbors outside St. Louis. Her home life was turbulent, and she had run away before. Around Christmas 1981, relatives found her with two unknown men, sparking an argument. Shortly after, Carolyn left home. At 17, she disappeared into the network of highways and truck stops that crisscrossed America, joining countless other young people trying to get somewhere, anywhere else. On February 14, 1982, motorists along Interstate 40 in Williams, Arizona made a grim discovery under a cedar tree. A woman's decomposing body had been dragged approximately 25 feet from the road. She wore blue jeans and a striped sweater, but no shoes. The Valentine's Day discovery gave her the name that would define her for 39 years, Valentine Sally. The autopsy determined she had been killed by suffocation or asphyxiation in early February 1982. Investigators found evidence of a recent root canal with dissolved aspirin near the tooth, clear signs of a severe toothache. She also had identifying scars on her foot and thigh and moles on her chest. Her hyoid bone remained intact, providing forensic specialists with specific information about how the asphyxiation occurred. But the most crucial lead came from 10 days before her body was found. On February 4, 1982, at the Monte Carlo truck stop, a witness named Patty Wilkins encountered a young woman suffering from a terrible toothache. The woman was with a truck driver described as being in his 50s, medium build, standing between 5'8" and 5'10", wearing a distinctive checker-patterned vest and a peacock-feathered cowboy hat. Wilkins, concerned, applied aspirin to the young woman's aching tooth, the same aspirin traces forensics would later find. Worried, Wilkins asked the young woman if she felt safe. She said she was. It was the last confirmed sighting of Carolyn Eaton alive. Years later, when investigators finally learned Valentine Sally's identity, Wilkins would remember that moment with clarity and tell them, "Find out who did it and let me go stomp on his toes, okay?" The truck driver was never identified. Over the years, speculation arose linking the case to Royal Russell Long, a convicted serial killer who died in 1993. Long was known to have traveled trucking routes through the Southwest during this period, but investigators never found concrete evidence connecting him to Carolyn's case. The theory remains unproven, one of many dead ends in a case that seemed destined to remain unsolved. Valentine Sally was featured on true crime programs throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Tips came in, but none led to her identification. The case needed a different approach, one that wouldn't exist for decades. Forensic, genetic genealogy. In February 2021, renowned forensic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, who had previously helped identify the Golden State Killer, used genetic genealogy to match Carolyn's DNA to relatives in Missouri. Building a family tree from genetic markers, investigators finally connected Valentine Sally to her real name. After 39 years, Carolyn Celeste Eaton could be properly identified. Carolyn was buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Williams, Arizona, remaining in the town where she was found. Her identification brought her family answers about what happened after that Christmas argument, but it couldn't bring justice. The case remains unsolved. The Williams Police Department still seeks information about the truck driver seen with her at the Monte Carlo truck stop, a man in a peacock-feathered hat who might hold the answers to what happened in those 10 days between the truck stop and the cedar tree. In the early 1980s, young hitchhikers were vulnerable to dangers from those who offered rides, and Carolyn's case stands as a reminder of how easily someone could vanish into the vast American highway system. Another woman's remains would surface in an even more unusual location. Belle in the Well, Louise Virginia Peterson Flesher. Louise Virginia Peterson Flesher was born in 1915 in West Virginia, living through World War I, the Great Depression, and into the space age. She attended high school in Wyoming, West Virginia, before marrying Donald Benjamin Flesher. Together they had 3 daughters, 2 of whom were still alive when Louise was finally identified in 2019. The family's movements took them from Wyoming back to West Virginia by 1944, eventually settling in Parkersburg. Louise became estranged from at least one daughter, which explains why no missing persons report was ever filed. Family relationships had fractured, and when Louise disappeared, those who might have noticed simply assumed she had moved on. By 1979, she had recently returned to the area near where her body would eventually be discovered, but the details of her life in those final months remain murky. In April 1981, someone made a disturbing discovery in Lawrence County, Ohio. Louise's body was found in a cistern, an underground water storage tank, weighted down with a cinder block. Based on the remains' condition, investigators estimated she had been there for 1 to 2 years, placing her passing around November 1979. The cause of death was manual strangulation. The method of concealment told its own story. Cisterns were common in rural Ohio for storing water, but using one to hide a body required knowledge of the location and considerable effort. Someone had to transport Louise to this isolated spot, along with the heavy concrete block used to weigh her down. The rural location meant the well could have remained undiscovered indefinitely. The finding was likely accidental. Despite immediate investigation, no suspects emerged. The case went cold, and Louise became known as Belle in the Well, one more unidentified victim lost to time. The condition of the remains, submerged in water for potentially 2 years, made DNA extraction extraordinarily difficult with 1980s technology. Even as forensic science advanced through the 1990s and 2000s, Belle's case remained one of the most challenging. The DNA Doe project took on her case, and volunteers would spend over 10,000 hours working to identify her, making it the organization's most difficult case to that point. The DNA had degraded severely from exposure to water and time. Building a genetic family tree required following distant relatives through complex genealogical connections, each branch requiring verification and documentation. In July 2019, the painstaking work paid off. DNA analysis through GED match connected Belle to one of her daughters. After 38 years in that cistern and 2 more years of intensive genealogical research, Belle in the Well had a name: Louise Virginia Peterson Flesher. The DNA Doe project expressed hope that naming her might prompt someone to come forward, someone who knew her, and perhaps even have information that leads to the identification of whoever killed her. But the identification raised as many questions as it answered. Who wanted Louise in that well? Was it someone who knew her? Someone who understood how isolated that cistern was? The manual strangulation suggested a personal confrontation, not a random encounter. The effort required to conceal her body indicated planning. Yet decades later, those answers remain elusive. The case remains open with the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office, which continues accepting tips. Investigators particularly want to hear from anyone who knew Louise in the late 1970s or remembers anything about her disappearance. Despite more than 4 decades passing, authorities believe someone might still have information that could solve this case. For now, though, Louise's story remains incomplete. Identified, but not avenged. Named, but not explained. The next case would reveal the dark reality behind a life few suspected. Fond du Lac County, Jane Doe, Amy Marie Yeary. Amy Marie Yeary was born on December 9, 1989, in Rockford, Illinois, growing up in the northern part of the state. But Amy's life would take a tragic turn. She became caught in trafficking networks, living a transient existence across Milwaukee, Chicago, and Beloit, moving through cities without the stability or safety most people take for granted. This exploitation shaped her final years and ultimately led to her end. In 2008, Amy tried to escape her circumstances. She called her mother, asking for a ride home. It was their last conversation. What happened after that call remains unclear, but Amy never made it home to Illinois. Instead, she ended up in Wisconsin, where her story would reach its tragic conclusion. On November 23, 2008, a discovery was made near Ashford, Wisconsin, in Fond du Lac County. Amy's body was found frozen in a creek. The winter cold had preserved her remains, but the same conditions that prevented immediate decomposition also complicated forensic analysis. The autopsy proved inconclusive regarding specific cause due to the state of the remains and how long she had been there, but investigators ruled the manner as homicide. Forensic examination revealed additional details about Amy's life. She had a healed rib fracture, evidence of past trauma, and spina bifida occulta, a common birth defect affecting the spine. Scientists conducted isotope analysis on her remains, which suggested she had spent time in both Southwest and Midwest regions, consistent with her known movements through trafficking networks. These isotope tests analyze chemical signatures in bones and teeth that reflect where someone lived based on the water and food they consumed. The case went cold. Amy was buried as Jane Doe in Cattaraugus Cemetery, her identity unknown to authorities. Without knowing who she was, investigators had little hope of finding who killed her. The case file gathered dust for years, representing one of countless tragedies affecting vulnerable people living on society's margins, people whose disappearances often go unnoticed or unreported. The breakthrough came in 2 stages. First, in November 2021, genetic genealogy finally identified Jane Doe as Amy Marie Yeary. The same technology solving other cold cases was applied to Amy's DNA, building a family tree that led investigators to her relatives. After 13 years, the frozen girl found in that Wisconsin creek had her name back. But investigators didn't stop there. They continued analyzing forensic evidence, and in 2023 achieved something rare in these decades-old cases. They identified a suspect through DNA analysis. James Otto Schneider, who had a history of violent offenses, was conclusively connected to Amy's case through forensic evidence. The DNA match was definitive. Investigators finally knew who had killed Amy Marie Yeary. There was just one problem. Schneider had passed away in 2022, shortly before investigators could officially name him. His connection to Amy's case came to light only after his passing, meaning there would never be a trial. never a public accounting of what happened in November 2008. The Fond du Lac County Sheriff's Office confirmed Schneider as their suspect, but could provide limited additional details due to his passing and the closed nature of the case. The investigation is now considered closed, though many questions remain unanswered. How did Amy encounter Schneider? What were the circumstances that led to that creek? The specific details may never be fully known, but at least Amy's family finally has answers about what happened after that phone call asking for a ride home. And unlike many cases involving trafficking victims, whose disappearances often vanish into bureaucratic cracks, Amy's story reached a conclusion. Her name is restored, her killer identified, even if traditional justice proved impossible. The next case would take investigators to the desert Southwest, where a poolside mystery had lingered for over 5 decades. Pecos Jane Doe, Jolain Hemi. Jolain Hemi was born on August 11, 1948, growing up on a Kansas farm outside Salina as the 9th of 15 siblings. Family members described her as shy, someone who had never had boyfriends and couldn't swim. She enjoyed family picnics and the rhythms of farm life. After graduating high school in 1966, she took work at drive-in diners, serving customers and saving money. On July 1, 1966, Jolain vanished from Kansas. 4 days later, on July 5, 1966, a woman's body was discovered in the swimming pool at Roper's Motel in Pecos, Texas. The death was ruled accidental drowning, but immediately, nothing about the case made sense. The woman had checked into the motel under a fake name, Mr. and Mrs. Russell J. Helm, with a male companion who fled the scene after her body was discovered. She had an abrasion on her head. And most puzzling of all, why would someone who couldn't swim be in a pool? The autopsy confirmed drowning as the cause, but the circumstances screamed of something more sinister. Investigators found handwriting on her foot that appeared to read Jolene, possibly written by the woman herself or her companion. The male who had registered at the motel with her disappeared immediately, never coming forward to identify his companion or explain what happened. The fake names suggested someone running from something or someone who didn't want to be traced. The woman was buried in Pecos as Jane Doe, and the case grew cold. Without an identity, investigators had no way to trace her movements or understand how a Kansas farm girl ended up drowned in a West Texas motel pool. Her sister Joyce would later recall that Jolain had a controlling boyfriend, someone the family didn't approve of, possibly the mysterious Joe written on her foot. But at the time, the Hemi family had no idea their shy sister had met such a tragic end so far from home. For 55 years, Pecos Jane Doe remained unidentified. The case represented one of those frustrating mysteries where suspicious circumstances suggested foul play, but the official ruling said accident. The male companion who fled became a ghost. Was he responsible for her passing, or just a frightened witness who panicked? The questions lingered unanswered through decades of changing forensic technology. The breakthrough came through the combined efforts of Othram Laboratory and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. In January 2021, genetic genealogy finally identified Pecos Jane Doe as Jolain Hemi. The technology worked with skeletal DNA that had been carefully preserved since 1966, building a family tree that eventually connected to her Kansas relatives. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children noted they never stopped looking, not even 55 years later. The identification brought Jolain's family bittersweet relief. They finally knew what happened to their sister who vanished that summer. but the answers came with devastating details. The controlling boyfriend Joyce remembered, the fake names, the drowning of someone who couldn't swim. It all painted a picture of a young woman who may have been trying to escape something or someone, only to meet tragedy at that motel pool. But identifying Jolain didn't solve her case. The male companion who registered as Russell J. Helm was never identified. The family suspects foul play despite the accidental drowning ruling, believing the circumstances are too suspicious to be coincidental. Who was the man she traveled with? Was he the controlling boyfriend the family remembered? Did he cause her drowning, either deliberately or through negligence? Or was he simply someone who panicked when tragedy struck and fled to avoid questions? Jolain's remains are still held in Pecos as evidence, never returned to Kansas for burial with her family. The case remains technically unsolved, classified as an accidental drowning, but surrounded by questions that may never be answered. The investigation continues as authorities hope someone might remember seeing the couple in Pecos in July 1966, or recognize the description of the man who called himself Russell J. Helm. For now, Jolain Hemi's story remains incomplete. A shy farm girl who couldn't swim, found drowned in a pool hundreds of miles from home, traveling under a false name with a man who vanished into history. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. From West Texas, the next case moves to Northern California, where discovery came decades after disappearance. Applegate Jane Doe, Patricia Anne Rose. Patricia Anne Rose was born around 1960, growing up to eventually settle in Sacramento, California. Her life would become complicated by a troubled marriage. She was estranged from her husband, John Bowden, and at some point used several aliases including Tori, Patty Bowden, and Patty Anderson, suggesting someone trying to create distance from her past or hide from someone. In 1980, Patricia disappeared from Sacramento. The circumstances of her disappearance emerged only later. Her young son was found alone in a hotel room. Patricia was gone, and her estranged husband became a person of interest, though no evidence emerged to support charges. The trail went cold immediately. A woman using multiple names, estranged from family, vanishing without witnesses or clear circumstances. For investigators, these cases are among the hardest to solve. 5 years later, in January 1985, skeletal remains were discovered in a rural area near Applegate, California, in Placer County. The location was isolated, the kind of place where remains could lie undiscovered for years. The condition of the skeleton made determining time since passing difficult, but investigators suspected the body had been there for several years. The circumstances suggested foul play, though the exact cause couldn't be determined from skeletal remains alone. Forensic anthropologists examined the remains, determining they belonged to a woman, but identification proved impossible with 1980s technology. The woman was buried as Jane Doe, another unidentified victim in a system overwhelmed with cold cases. The rural location, the skeletal condition, and the lack of missing persons reports matching her description meant the case quickly went cold. For nearly 40 years, Applegate Jane Doe remained nameless. The case represented the particular tragedy of marginalized individuals, people living on the edges of society, using aliases, estranged from family, whose disappearances often go unreported or uninvestigated. When these individuals meet tragic ends, connecting their remains to their identities becomes exponentially harder. The breakthrough came through Othram Laboratories' advanced DNA analysis capabilities. The skeletal remains had yielded degraded DNA, but Othram's specialized sequencing technology could work with samples other labs couldn't. The lab extracted usable genetic material and built a profile, then used genetic genealogy to construct a family tree. In February 2024, DNA matching connected the remains to Patricia's sibling, finally identifying Applegate Jane Doe as Patricia Anne Rose. The identification opened old wounds and new questions. Patricia had been missing since 1980. Her remains found in 1985. Somewhere in those 5 years, she had ended up in that isolated Placer County location. The Placer County Sheriff's Office began interviewing family members, trying to piece together Patricia's movements in 1980 and understand how she ended up in Applegate. Her estranged husband, John Bowden, became a focus of renewed investigation. The circumstances of her disappearance, the child left alone in a hotel, her use of aliases, the estrangement, suggested someone possibly fleeing from danger. But decades had passed, memories had faded, and evidence had deteriorated. Proving what happened to Patricia Rose would be extraordinarily difficult. The case remains open as a suspicious circumstance investigation, with the Placer County Sheriff's Office seeking any information about Patricia's life in 1980, her associates, and anyone who might have seen her in the Applegate area. The identification breakthrough in 2024 makes this one of the most recent cases to be solved through genetic genealogy, yet it remains frustratingly unresolved. Patricia has her name back, but justice remains elusive. The questions multiply. Who took Patricia to Applegate? Was it her estranged husband, someone else she knew, or a stranger? What happened in those years between her disappearance and the discovery of her remains? For now, those answers remain buried with the secrets of 1980's Sacramento. The next victim's story would emerge from an even more shocking hiding place. Trunk Lady, Sylvia June Atherton. Sylvia June Atherton was born around 1928, living through the Great Depression and World War II. Before building a family in Tucson, Arizona, she became a mother to 5 children, creating what seemed like a stable life in the desert Southwest. But in 1965, that life took a turn. Sylvia left Tucson with a man named Stuart Brown and 3 of her children, heading to Chicago. She left 2 daughters behind. Arizona, a decision that would haunt the family for decades. The move to Chicago should have been a new beginning. Instead, Sylvia vanished. Her daughters in Arizona lost contact, and the 3 children who went with her eventually lost track of their mother as well. In the chaos of the 1960s, with families fragmenting and people moving frequently, Sylvia's absence didn't trigger immediate alarm. She had become estranged from some of her children, and estrangement often looks like choice rather than tragedy. On October 31st, 1969, Halloween, hunters in the woods near St. Petersburg, Florida, made a macabre discovery. Inside an abandoned trunk, they found a woman's body. She had been manually strangled with a bolo tie, a distinctive Western-style necktie with a decorative clasp. The victim also had injuries to her head. The trunk itself became part of the crime scene analysis. Someone had gone to considerable effort to conceal this body, choosing a trunk and transporting it to this isolated wooded area. The autopsy confirmed strangulation as the cause, with the bolo tie suggesting either a weapon of opportunity or something significant to the killer. The head injuries indicated a violent confrontation before the strangulation. But without any identification on the body and with the condition of the remains, investigators had no leads on who she was or who might have killed her. She became known as Trunk Lady a Halloween discovery that remained one of Florida's most perplexing mysteries. The investigation in 1969 generated few leads. The trunk provided no useful evidence, the bolo tie couldn't be traced, and missing persons reports from the era yielded no matches. The case went cold and stayed that way for decades. Even as forensic science advanced through the 1980s and 1990s, Trunk Lady remained unidentified. The trunk that concealed her also seemed to have concealed her identity permanently. What made this case particularly challenging for modern forensic genealogy was the condition of the samples. After more than 50 years, the DNA had severely degraded. But in 2023, Othram Laboratory took on the challenge. Using advanced sequencing techniques designed specifically for degraded samples, they extracted usable genetic material from hair and skin samples that had been carefully preserved since 1969. The lab built a DNA profile, then used genetic genealogy to construct family tree. In May 2023, the breakthrough arrived. Trunk Lady was identified as Sylvia June Atherton. After 53 years in that trunk, first literally, then figuratively as evidence, Sylvia finally had her name back. Her daughter Cylin Gates learned her mother's fate more than 5 decades after losing contact. She told reporters, "It was shocking, the mix of relief at finally knowing and horror at what happened." But the identification raised immediate questions. How did Sylvia get from Chicago to St. Petersburg? What happened between 1965 when she left Tucson and 1969 when her body was found in Florida? Who strangled her with that bolo tie? Was it Stuart Brown, the man she left Arizona with, or someone else she encountered in the intervening years? The case remains unsolved. The St. Petersburg Police Department particularly wants to locate Sylvia's 2 daughters who were left behind in Arizona. Now elderly women themselves, they might hold crucial information about their mother's life, her relationship with Stuart Brown, and what might have led to her ending up in that Florida trunk. Stuart Brown's whereabouts and current status are unknown. The bolo tie suggests a Western connection, possibly pointing back to Arizona or someone from that part of Sylvia's life. After 53 years, Sylvia June Atherton has her identity restored, but justice remains distant. Someone put her in that trunk. Someone strangled her with that bolo tie, and that person was never held accountable. The identification breakthrough offers hope that witnesses might finally come forward, that memories might be jogged, and that Sylvia's killer might finally be named, even if too much time has passed for prosecution. But not every unidentified person met a violent end, as the next case would prove. Grateful Doe, Jason Patrick Callahan. Jason Patrick Callahan was born on April 18, 1976, in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. He grew up in a family that struggled to keep track of him. Jason had a pattern of running away, disappearing for periods before returning. His family eventually stopped reporting his absences, assuming he would come back when he was ready. Jason was drawn to the counterculture music scene, particularly the Grateful Dead, the iconic band whose followers often traveled from concert to concert in a nomadic lifestyle. On June 1, 1995, Jason left home for what he said would be a Grateful Dead concert. At 19, he was eager to experience the traveling Dead scene, joining the community of fans who followed the band across the country. He carried concert tickets and had a note from someone named Caroline, suggesting connections he'd made in the Dead community. For Jason, this wasn't just about music. It was about finding a place where he belonged. On June 26, 1995, a devastating car crash occurred on Route 95 in Emporia, Virginia. The driver, Michael Hager, lost control of the vehicle, Investigators suspected he fell asleep at the wheel. The car crashed violently, and both occupants suffered severe trauma. Hager survived but sustained serious injuries. His passenger died from blunt force trauma at the scene. The passenger carried no identification, only those Grateful Dead concert tickets and Caroline's note. The autopsy confirmed the cause as blunt force trauma from the crash. Toxicology reports showed no drugs or alcohol in the young man's system. This was purely a tragic accident, not impairment. But without ID, authorities couldn't notify family. They buried him as John Doe, and he became known as Grateful Doe due to those concert tickets found with him. What made this case different from most John Does was the era in which it occurred. By the 2010s, internet sleuths had begun taking interest in unidentified persons cases. Online communities on Reddit and Facebook began investigating Grateful Doe, convinced that someone must be missing this young deadhead. They analyzed the Grateful Dead's 1995 tour schedule, looked for missing persons reports from that time, and shared the case widely on social media. The crowdsourced investigation paid off. Someone who saw the case shared online recognized details that matched a missing person they knew about. This led to a potential family match. In December 2015, DNA testing confirmed that Grateful Doe was Jason Patrick Callahan. After 20 years, the young man who died chasing a concert finally had his name back. Jason's half-sister, Shannon Michelson, expressed the bittersweet nature of the identification. "I'm glad it was solved, but I'm also incredibly sad because I wanted so badly to reconnect with him." The family had assumed Jason was alive somewhere, living his nomadic lifestyle. Learning he had been gone for 2 decades was devastating. Unlike the other cases, there was no killer to identify, no perpetrator to hunt. Michael Hager, the driver, had simply fallen asleep, a tragic mistake with fatal consequences, but not a crime. The case is resolved as an accident, with no criminal proceedings. Jason was a victim of circumstance, a young man pursuing his passion who happened to be in a car when a tired driver lost control. The final case involves not one victim, but 2 who died together. Sumpter County Does, Pamela Buckley and James Freund. Pamela Mae Buckley was born on December 16, 1951, in Minnesota. She grew up to participate in beauty pageants and became a member of a folk music trio called Sunlending, suggesting an artistic and performance-oriented personality. James Paul Freund was born on September 16, 1946, in Pennsylvania, graduating from McCaskey High School in Lancaster before moving into adult life. Both were in their 20s when they met and began traveling together in the mid-1970s. In December 1975, Pamela and James were last seen together, hitchhiking, a common practice in the 1970s when young people often traveled the country, relying on rides from strangers. Their families lost contact, but in an era before cell phones and with the counterculture's emphasis on dropping out, this didn't immediately trigger alarm. Young people disappeared into alternative lifestyles regularly, and families often assumed they would eventually resurface. On August 9, 1976, a horrifying discovery was made on a dirt road in Sumpter County, South Carolina. 2 bodies were found, positioned side by side, a man and a woman. Both had been shot with a .357 revolver, the wounds to their upper chests indicating an execution-style approach. The victims wore simple clothing, and forensic examination revealed dental work and distinctive rings that would later aid in identification. But in 1976, without those identifications, they became Sumpter County's Jane and John Doe, The autopsies confirmed they died from gunshot wounds, and the positioning suggested they had been forced to lie down before being shot. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. It was deliberate execution. The isolated dirt road location indicated the killer had transported them there specifically, away from witnesses and traffic. The crime scene suggested someone who knew the area and had planned the disposal of the bodies. Investigators immediately suspected hitchhiking had led to their demise. Two travelers who accepted the wrong ride from the wrong person. But without knowing who the victims were, tracing their movements proved impossible. The case generated leads, but no breakthroughs. Two suspects would eventually emerge, though neither would ever be charged. Lonnie George Henry became a person of interest when investigators learned he owned a .357 revolver, the same caliber used in the slayings. Henry was questioned and took a polygraph test, which he passed. Without additional evidence linking him to the scene, investigators couldn't charge him. Henry passed away in 1982, taking any knowledge he had to the grave. The second suspect was even more notorious. Serial killer Henry Lee Lucas confessed to the Sumpter County murders, as he confessed to hundreds of crimes across America. But Lucas's confessions were notoriously unreliable. He confessed to murders he couldn't have committed, seemingly seeking attention or hoping to manipulate the system. He died in 2001 without providing any credible evidence of his involvement. Most investigators believe Lucas was simply adding the Sumpter County case to his collection of false confessions. For 45 years, the couple remained unidentified. The case represented a particular frustration, clearly a double homicide, with suspects identified, but no way to prove anything or even know who the victims were. Then, in January 2021, the DNA Doe Project successfully used genetic genealogy to identify both victims, Pamela Mae Buckley and James Paul Freund. The DNA analysis and genealogical research finally connected the Jane and John Doe to their families in Minnesota and Pennsylvania. The identification allowed investigators to trace Pamela and James's movements before their passing. They confirmed the couple had been hitchhiking through the South in 1975 and 1976, likely trying to reach somewhere specific or simply traveling for the experience. The isolated dirt road where they died suggested they had accepted a ride from someone who drove them to that remote location with deliberate intent. The case remains unsolved, with both primary suspects deceased. The Sumpter County Sheriff's Office continues to investigate, hoping that someone who knew Lonnie George Henry or encountered Pamela and James in 1976 might finally come forward with information. The .357 revolver was never recovered, and without that weapon or additional forensic evidence, proving who pulled the trigger remains nearly impossible. For now, Pamela Mae Buckley and James Paul Freund have their names back and families who can properly mourn them. But the person who executed them on that South Carolina dirt road has never been held accountable. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.